Um, well, super nice to see you all. Welcome here at the Independent School for the City for the 31st edition of Schools Out. Can we turn off the music? Also nice. But nice, okay. No, for the 31st edition of Schools Out with Lisa Doeland over here. Um, Before we're going to start, I quickly want to explain you something about the school. Then I will introduce Lisa. We will have a lecture by Lisa. And then, as always with Schools Out, we follow up the lecture with showing off a short film. A film of around 10 minutes. This time it's every time selected by people from the Architecture Film Festival of Rotterdam. And this time Christina Ampatsidou will give an introduction to the film, and then after the film, we hope you all stick around for a drink at the bar and to have a nice conversation about everything that has been said today. A little bit about the school. So, Independent School for the City. We gave it a subtitle, which is a playground for urban thinkers, doers, and designers. So it basically already says it. We're trying to be a place for everybody that in a one way or the other works on urban questions on the city. And it's a school that focuses on, let's say, people that already went to school. So professionals that want to continue to develop themselves. And we organize all sorts of activities, studios, courses, which are often with 10 to 15 people that during 1 week or during a certain period of time we will focus on a question or on a certain assignment. And also we organize a whole series of public lectures, of which the Schools Out is the most known one, since this is the 31st time already. That we also open up to a broader audience. So we're super happy that also now there's so many faces in the room. So that's a bit about us. For the Schools Out program, so this every last Friday of the month, we have almost have the whole program for the year ready. So if you like it tonight, please come also to one of the next events. Next month, in March, we will have Todd Rice, and that lecture will be about the new urbanization in the Middle East, and also how the architecture of Dubai has kind of created an image on what this urbanization kind of means. So it's kind of a critical approach to this as well, but it also gives a historical development of what has been going on in that whole urbanization and what are the latest plans, without saying their names. And then in April, there's Maria Roszkowska from Disnovation, who made a post-growth city game, or post-growth game, really trying to find alternative ways for this, growth-focused economy that we have. And they're doing all sorts of projects also around this idea of post-growth and the Anthropocene. This one is an old one, actually. What is it? The 23rd of June, we will have a school party, so mark that in your agendas already. We hope to see you all there. Also, just briefly to say something about the upcoming studios. If you're interested, you can still sign up. In April, we will organize a week that's called the Plus 2.5 Degrees City, during which we're going to look at what 2.5 degree temperature rise would mean for the city of Rotterdam, for cities in general. What if it becomes warmer in a city? How can we adapt? What type of urban plans should we make? How would life be in the city? What are all the effects on life in the city? In May, we will have a studio with Sam Jacob, a British architect and designer artist. It's called Crude Hints, and there we will have some kind of speculative archaeology. in which we're going to look at what would be the artifacts that people would find of our times in 100 years. So we're going to speculate on that as well. And in May, actually at the beginning of June, we're starting another edition of our Film and Architecture Studio, which is together with the Architecture Film Festival Rotterdam, during which we're basically mainly looking at the language of film and film as a way to research the city, to tell narratives. And in the end, all the participants also make a short film of 2 minutes, which will be shown at the Architecture Film Festival of Rotterdam in October. So those are some things that are coming up up to the summer break. And we have actually, I'm not going to mention everything, but we have compiled a program for the whole year already. There's some posters hanging around. I'm excited, at least. It's a lot of cool stuff, so please check it out if you're interested. Then, of course, we're here tonight for Lisa Doeland. I just briefly want to introduce her. We got to know Lisa actually through someone that we work with a lot here in the school, Dirk Simons. And he's a landscape architect and environmental thinker. And with him, we developed our line in the school, a line of activities that are centered around the Anthropocene. So that basically deals with the impact that we as mankind have on the Earth's systems. Climate change, material scarcity, biodiversity loss, all the fun stuff. And this is like we have developed a whole line of activities around that. And during one of the courses, we also invited Lisa to give a lecture last year. And we thought her story was so refreshing in a way that we again wanted to invite her for a Schools Out and to share her thoughts with all you guys. So we're super happy that you're here. Briefly, something about Lisa's background. Because Lisa is a philosopher, a researcher, a writer, teaches a lot as well. And she's focusing on the ontology of waste, hauntology, dark ecology, capitalism and desire, and apocalyptic thought. And she has a soft spot for the uncanny, the monstrous, and the figure of the detective. And she lectures both at the Radboud University in Nijmegen and the University of Amsterdam, where she teaches on ethics and contemporary issues such as waste, ecology, the Anthropocene, and apocalyptic thinking. And in her PhD research, she focuses on the different and strange relation that we have with our garbage and with trash, and how it enables us to critically reflect on modernity, and above all, its dark side. And Lisa challenges us to critically reflect on eco-modern myths and fantasies such as that of recycling without leftovers in a circular economy. And this is also a central part of your upcoming book. It's Apocalypsophy on recycling, green growth, and other dangerous fantasies, which is coming up in June, if I understand correctly. And tonight, Lisa will introduce us to her view on the Anthropocene. And she looks at it with a general feeling of pessimism as a good antidote to the unfounded belief in technological solutions and quick fixes, and which are also very common, of course, in the architecture world. Well, I hope you really have a nice evening. Get ready also, don't become too depressed. I think there's some hope in your story as well. And I think it's also nice, in the end, we will have each other to cry at the bar at the end of the evening. So with that introduction, I want to give the floor to Lisa. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Mike. That's some introduction. I am very happy to be here and also to see that there's so many of you here. And I must say, I I did get the jitters after all. And one of the reasons is that, so as Mike mentioned, I have a book coming out. So I'm shamelessly doing, I don't know, putting it up there. So it's in Dutch. And one of the chapters is also called Apocalypsophy. Still not really sure how to pronounce that. Apocalypsophy. I'll stick with that one, I think. And so tonight, I want to share the first chapter of that book. Of course, for now, the book's in Dutch, so I made a translation. And this is the first time that I'm discussing it. So trying to connect, I don't know, philosophy and the apocalypse. I hope it works out. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to be kind of reading, but I'll do my best to not just look down. Okay, there we go. Last year, my partner got a water purifier from Sinterklaas. It was the pretty handy kind. I think it was that one up there. I'm not really sure. They all look alike, and there are many. The pretty handy kind suited for acute survival situations. So it goes in the apocalyptic 20s, in which capitalism has found a way to capitalize on our fear of death in general and our trembling for the end of the world as we know it in particular. What he got from Sinterklaas was not so much a water purifier, but the illusion of certainty, where hedge fund and tech billionaires wonder if they should have their bunkers built in Alaska or New Zealand. The less wealthy prepare with purifiers, dried food, and handy tools for on the road. My being uncomfortable with the Sinterklaas festivities predates last year's events. How to make my daughter happy with nice presents without initiating her into consumer capitalism. How to celebrate what is, knowing that it will disappear, perhaps even because of this celebrating. For in going along with it, I'm buying into something that is untenable, unsustainable. And how to tell her about that, she's 12, without burdening her with a climate shadow. There is a podcast, a Dutch podcast, in which a woman explains that from a young age on, she feels that she has been living with what she calls a climate shadow. That has her feeling she's on some kind of sinking ship. And in the podcast she says, I must have been 8, 9, when my father gave a long speech on all these things that were under threat. The environment, the animals, the seas, everything. She describes how she was overwhelmed by the helplessness from that speech. She tells us she doesn't suffer from what is nowadays called climate fear or a climate depression. Instead, she is living with this climate shadow. I have sometimes wondered, she says, if this event isn't where this gloomy shadow comes from that looms over my life. That this has caught me when I was a child and has never left. What if your parent has given up hope? What to do, what to hold on to then? And of course, I'm afraid that I too will burden my children, I have a son as well, with a climate shadow, and I don't want to. I think that this climate shadow can best be conceptualized as a kind of fatalism. The idea that there is nothing you can do. The idea that the future is somehow fixed and unavoidable. But what if you believe, as I do, that it is important too that we do not imagine the future to be bright and shiny and hopeful in a general sense. But instead, think of it as dark, perhaps even as apocalyptic. According to Croatian philosopher and activist Sreko Horvat, the apocalypse, so this he explains in this book, should be taken for an X-ray machine from the future, as he calls it. And this machine allows us to get the architecture of our culture, our present culture, into focus. We should think of the apocalypse not as the end of the world, but as a lifting of the veil. And this is the meaning of the old Greek word apocalyptine, where apocalypse comes from. So what is revealed? The ever-deepening mass extinction, according to Horvat. And I follow him there. And if we do not act, that extinction will be even worse than we fear. It will be an apocalypse without a revelation. Instead of the ongoing ending of worlds, think of the cultures and societies that have come and gone in the past, but also of the climate refugees right now, of people losing the land of their ancestors through deforestations, of animals losing their habitat. However, this apocalypse without revelation that will otherwise await us is the full destruction of the biosphere and of the semiosphere. It will not just be the end of life, bios, as we know it, but also be the end of meaning, semiotics. There will be no one left to read the signs. There will be no one left to even read and fear the end of the world. It is even possible, Horvat writes, that the meaning of apocalyptine itself is lost, simply because there is no one left to which the secret can be revealed. It wouldn't even matter then if nuclear waste leaks or if plastics accumulates. There would be no one left to suffer because of it, to die because of it. This way of thinking about the apocalypse goes back to one of the first stories about the end of the world, that of the Ark of Noah. That is, more in particular, to the retelling of this story by the German essayist and philosopher Gunther Anders. In his version of the story of Noah, Noah is sick of being a prophet of doom, whom nobody takes seriously anymore. And so, Noah dresses up as if he is in mourning and goes out into the streets. When people ask him what he's in mourning for, which catastrophe has taken place, he says, the day after tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, the flood is something that will have been. And when the flood has been, everything that was will not have existed. When the flood will have taken everything that was, it will be too late for us to remember, for there will be no one living left. And there will be no difference between those who died and those who mourn. Noah explains that he wants to turn the arrow of time, and therefore he mourns for tomorrow's dead today. And blimey, that night a carpenter knocks at his door and says, "Let me build you an ark and make it untrue." The French engineer and philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy draws on Anders' retelling of this story to argue for what he calls enlightened doomsaying. To make sure we take a looming catastrophe seriously, he explains, we have to take it for something that is unavoidable, even if our final goal is to make sure the catastrophe does not take place. In other words, there is something complicated about our relationship to the future that has to be both inevitable and preventable at the same time. This is what Dupuy calls the paradox of doomsaying. And he explains that this enlightened doomsaying is not so much a principle, but a philosophical attitude. And this attitude is to challenge our normal way of thinking about the world and about time. It is important, therefore, to not take the future for something that will come, but for something that will have been. Only when we conceive of a catastrophe as something that has already taken place do we allow room for another end of the world, another end of time, another end time. The point of doomsaying is to break into a present that itself is already catastrophic. From this perspective, the discourse that has nowadays has us thinking we might be just in time, that it is 5 minutes to 12, that it is almost too late but not quite, if only we, whatever, is something that we need to let go of. The point is not to avoid a catastrophe that lies in wait, but to change the present, to change the status quo that is itself already disastrous. As climate activists, as the climate activists of Extinction Rebellion, myself included, are painstakingly aware of, it is not that we should act before it is too late, but because it is too late. In this, the meaning of the too late changes. It is no longer meant as a way to have people take to the streets to hold on, to hold on to what they have, but in order to save something that can be saved from the wreckage, and most of all, to challenge that which furthers this ongoing catastrophe, the ongoing extinction. Extinction is not what awaits us, that's what's already going on. And the longer we ignore it, the worse it will get. German philosopher Walter Benjamin, who argued that the fact that things go on like this is itself the catastrophe, was already very much aware of this. We tend to take catastrophes for all or nothing events. But according to Benjamin, it is the continuation of the catastrophe or the situation itself that we should be wary of. And he connects this to our belief in progress. So we keep our eyes on the future and don't look back. The catastrophe is not that which awaits us, but that which is already taking place, according to Benjamin. A catastrophe is then not a sudden event that comes from the future, but the continuation of current events. And the thing to do is to try and break that continuum. The crisis is now. The crisis is the continuation of the fossil fuel industry, and the catastrophe is the continued existence of that industry. Nowhere did Benjamin write about this more poignant, more gripping than in Thesis on the Concept of History, in a text from 1940, in which he describes what he calls the angel of history. So this is the angel of history that has to powerlessly watch history unfold. Benjamin writes, and I'll just put it up there as well. There is a painting by Klee called Angelus Novus. An angel is depicted there who looks as though he were about to distance himself from something which he is staring at. His eyes are opened wide, his mouth stands open, and his wings are outstretched. The angel of history must look just so. His face is turned towards the past. And where we see the appearance of a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which unceasingly piles rubble on top of rubble and hurls it before his feet. He would like to pause for a moment so fair to awaken the dead and piece together what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has caught itself up in his wings and is so strong that the angel can no longer close them. The storm drives him irresistibly into the future to which his back is turned. While the rubble heap before him grows sky high, that which we call progress is this storm. Progress then leads to rubble and, as Benjamin puts it elsewhere, to barbarism. Or, as I suggest here, to extinction. For isn't it about extinction that Benjamin angel would warn us nowadays? Just like Noah, Benjamin's angel does not follow the arrow of time. His angel too is in mourning. He would like to make whole what has been smashed. And instead he points our attention to the rubble that our present amounts to. So how to see what Benjamin's angel sees? Can we learn to see progress as a piling of rubble upon rubble? How can we let that sink in? And can apocalyptic thought help us do that? The apocalypse tends to be too big, too overwhelming. It are the ghosts of history, French contemporary philosopher Frédéric Nérat argues, that Benjamin's angel spoke to before he drew his last breath. Ghosts that come back from the future to tell us how bad it is. And he writes, but a storm is blowing from Hollywood, full of catastrophic scenarios, images of the end and fantasies about the day after tomorrow. The storm propels the ghosts of history back into the future, while the pile of zombies and savage motorcycle gangs before them grows skyward. Be it named progress or risk society, the storm has exactly the same effect. Too loud. It prevents us from hearing the ghosts of history, our own ghosts, the ghosts of ourselves. So, while we might sometimes feel that a series like The Walking Dead, in one way or another, prepares us for a zombie apocalypse, or more actually for a totally wrecked and lawless world, or movies like The Road or Mad Max prepare us for a post-apocalyptic situation, their main goal is to function, or so I argue, like a defense mechanism from a psychological perspective. We are both soothed and numbed by these apocalyptic scenarios. And they numb us in such a way that we cannot hear what we have to tell ourselves and what we, in fact, already know. If we go on like this, we are going to go extinct. We are then not just threatened by the mass extinction of plants, animals, and humans, but haunted. So what does it mean to be haunted? Where there are ghosts, there is some injustice that needs to be set right. Every ghost story is a story about injustice. There is some unfinished business, and the ghost comes back to demand we pay attention to it. The problem with extinction, however, is that there will be no one left to haunt. There will be no one left to demand justice is done. Just like Noah, in the story of Noah, there will be no one left to mourn. Those who disappear from the future also disappear from the past. As Nérat explains, the paradox is that only the choice for a future that is now far from realistic, a future in which there will actually be future generations that can appeal to our sense of justice, can we avoid future generations being non-existent. It is this paradoxical situation that philosophers struggle with when they think about future generations. Will they even come into being? With this in the back of our minds, the meaning of to me that is a classic Amerindian truth, I'm not sure if you know it, takes on a different meaning, and this truth is the earth is loaned to us by our children. Perhaps you knew it already. The problem of future generations and of intergenerational justice is that this relationship does not allow for reciprocity. The following generations will inherit without being able to give anything back. More specifically, our generation can burden future generations with radioactive waste, with accumulating plastics and microplastics, with eroded soils, with impoverished ecosystems, with acidified oceans, but they cannot. This forces us to project ourselves into the future and to look at the present from a point of time that we will have made possible, or not. the hope that is embedded in this, in imagining an earth that was loaned to us by our children, is that it allows present and future to meet, hopefully. That it promises the possibility of some kind of reciprocity between this generation and future generations. Knowing too that when this future does not come into being, there will be no one left to give meaning to what we shall have done. The ghosts that Nera speaks of are then not so much the ghosts of those who have not yet been born, or the ghost of those that are no longer there, but the ghost of those that will not have been. In short, these ghosts are our own ghosts who tell us that we cannot go on like this. The ghosts of extinction are the ghosts of a past and a present that will not have been because it does not have a future. Just like Gunther Anders, Nera stresses the importance of the imagination. We have to keep on imagining a future, even if it's a horrible one, and we must keep in mind that business as usual is that which silences ghosts. As I mentioned earlier, you'd think that the omnipresence of the apocalypse in popular culture is a way for us to actually engage with our fear of death and of things ending. But its function seems to be rather to exorcise the specter of the end. All these spectacles rather calm our fears, make it unreal. And this leads to the normalization of catastrophes and even to the commodification of the apocalypse. The water purifier that I started this lecture with is a good example, but small. A bigger and more disturbing example is the tourist industry that bloomed around Chernobyl, complete with t-shirts saying, "Enjoy Chernobyl, die later." Horvath describes these in his book, After the Apocalypse. The interesting thing is, of course, that this industry has now already collapsed. For not long after Horvath published his book in 2021, the Russians invaded Ukraine. So when I wrote this chapter, it's been a few months, at least the first version, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant was still in Russian hands, and there were still great worries about it. Now, it still hasn't happened, but perhaps when someone reads this chapter in the future, a meltdown has already taken place. There's a weird thing with time going on here. But back to Chernobyl, at the point in time, Horvath wrote about it. By commodifying the apocalypse, he argues, it is normalized. Where the classic memento mori reminds us, so yeah, think of death, remember dying, reminds us of our mortality and the ephemerality of things, but at the same time urges us to learn how to do that, how to die, how to deal with mortality. The commodification of the apocalypse heeds no warning. The memento mori, or so Horvath argues, has been replaced by the memento consume. Keep calm and consume, so to say. However, this too is nothing new. It happened already in the 1950s in the atomic age. After the atom bombs had been dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the specter of nuclear annihilation loomed large. But fear of the bomb soon turned into the appeal of the spectacle of nuclear annihilation. So I'm not sure. So do you know what we're looking at? Anyone? Yeah, so Las Vegas, yeah. And then, of course, in the back, a nuclear bomb has been detonated, or a test. It was a nuclear test site. So the most bizarre example of this is I would say, is the tourist industry that bloomed in the 1950s in Las Vegas because of the atomic testing site in the nearby Mojave Desert. And in the documentary, The Real History of Las Vegas, documentary of the alternate history of Las Vegas from 2014, we get a stranging insight into it. So the atomic testing program, as is explained by one of the people featuring in this documentary, gave a certain legitimacy to Las Vegas, that up until then had been a small town in the desert, known for gambling and for prostitution. But then, all of a sudden, they were helping to win the Cold War. Everything was atomic, and Las Vegas was the only town with a front row seat to ground zero. And in the hands of the local PR machine, the specter of nuclear annihilation turned into a spectacle. Casinos threw bomb parties and arranged for limousines to take you to places where you could watch the blast up close, a full picnic basket included. So it became part of the show. The nuclear mushroom cloud, as someone else in the documentary explains, was, I don't know, kind of powerful, sexy, dangerous, and therefore perfectly in line with the appeal of risk and taking risk and gambling that, of course, characterized Las Vegas. The weird thing is that, of course, in the meantime, the crowd that gathered to watch the show was standing in nuclear fallout. The radioactive residue that had been torpedoed into the higher atmosphere during the nuclear explosion and came tumbling down as soon as the shock wave subsided. And so, I would like to return once again to the Sinterklaas festivities and the water purifier. It wasn't a spectacle, but it sure was an example of the commodification of the apocalypse that allows us to suppress existential fears. Apocalyptic thought suggests, the apocalypse in general suggests a clear beginning and a clear end, a clear before and a clear after. In short, some kind of clarity. That's at least how it's depicted in movies mostly. So the world might end, but at least we know where we're at. It is this longing for clarity that explains, I think, why we like to indulge in what Lee Phillips called collapse porn, or what Thijs Leister calls collective catastrophilia. So thinking in terms of the apocalypse and of the end of the world gives us something to hold on to. Everything is going to shit, but one thing's for sure, this is the way the world ends. And we kind of know how the world will end, and we have an inkling of how to prepare for it. And this then explains the appeal of end-of-time fantasies, because it allows us to project ourselves at a comfortable distance at the same time. This is what journalist Hugo Lundgren calls pessimism porn. So we already had collapse porn, collective catastrophilia, and I will focus now on pessimism porn. So he coined this neologism in 2009 in an article in the New Yorker. In this article, he asks how come we seem to enjoy the disasters that are looming sometimes. So in that instance, the disaster of the financial crisis and what that might lead to. The crisis from 2008. So thinking about what you do when supermarkets were looted, what routes you could best take out of the city, there is something exciting to it, he explains. Just like porn, the variety of fantasies offers you the illusion of control, while at the same time it keeps you wanting more. It also feeds your intellectual pride. You feel superior because, contrary to all the losers in the street, you do have an inkling of what's to come. And it might be hell that's coming, but at least you've prepared. But shouldn't we instead let the hellishness of things set in isn't indulging in pessimism porn the best way to keep at bay what scares us? Porn is, of course, also about voyeurism, about the pleasure of knowing that you're at a distance from that which you're watching or who you're watching. It is there, in the future, the apocalypse, and I'm looking at it. I am, in short, not part of it. Our end-of-time fantasies and our thinking in terms of ends in general, then, allow us to not worry too much about what's already going on. A detour through classic philosophy. Not long before he took the cup of poison in Plato's dialogue Phaedo, Socrates, the philosopher, says, who is devoted to philosophy is devoted to death and to dying. So learning philosophy is about learning how to die. Until I actually read this famous dialogue, I always thought this philosophical one-liner was concerned with dealing with mortality, with the fact that we are finite, mortal beings, and the fact that death always follows life, and that this is hard to deal with and hard to comprehend. In short, with existential matters. But that, as it turns out, is not what Socrates is concerned with. Philosophy, Socrates explains, is a purely mental activity, and the one who philosophizes would therefore like to escape the confines of the body and purely stand on its own. I don't know, just the mind. The body is in the way. Philosophy, as learning how to die, is then not learning to deal with mortality, but instead finally being rid of that body that muddles the mind. So this is not, I would say, how we should take it. And in the documentary Examined Life, American philosopher Cornel West stresses that we should think of death not as something abstract, like Socrates did, but as something concrete, something tangible, something bodily. We are born very much from and as physical beings, pushed out of our mothers with around us the smell of blood and feces. And we die like a rotting and stinking corpse. So not physical and mortal in an abstract sense, but embodied with all the pain, fear, and suffering that entails. We are then, with a wink to another philosopher, Heidegger, we're not so much zum Tode, but zum Leiche, zum Corpse. It is an existential thing that does not allow for sublimation by putting it at a safe mental distance. So, what should philosophy do or be in times of extinction, in which the thing is not just to learn how to die, but to learn how to go extinct? In a way, American philosopher Roy Scranton too tries to answer that question. In Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, he argues that learning to die nowadays means learning to accept that our civilization is already doomed, has already ended. So nowadays, we should not just learn how to die individually, but as a civilization. However, that the end of the world as we know it cannot be avoided does not mean that he believes humankind will go extinct. As he explained to me in an interview, and I quote, "The fact is that humans are a resilient and virulent species. We're likely to survive for the foreseeable future. There are possibilities offered by scientific assessments that could lead to human extinction, but regardless, there's going to be humans around for quite a while, and they will find ways to live. They will find ways to have meaningful, valuable lives. They will meet meaning out of whatever horrific tragedy or hellscape they find themselves in, and that will be the world to them. And there will be moments of joy, and there will be moments of togetherness, and there will be love. There will be the full range of human experience, because that's what we do." End quote. And although life will be different than it is now, we should not worry too much about it being finite. and quote again, I don't feel any need for us to cling to civilization as we know it. We've made some beautiful things and we'd like to pass on some of these things, pass on, but I think it's more important to challenge at this, the more important challenge at this point is a personal challenge. It's simple, how to live ethically in this transition and how to offer something to our children and maybe our children's children that can help them navigate this transition in the best way possible. So Scranton was criticized for this seemingly fatalist approach. Among others by ecologist Andreas Malm, who argued that Scranton's reconciliation with the being finite of things and the end of civilization could lead to some kind of passive attitude. With a wink to Frederick Jameson, who famously argued that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, Malm wrote that for Scranton, it seems to be easier to imagine learning to die than learning how to fight. Like slavery would have ever been abolished if no one had stood up to fight against it, both with words and with fists. As if women would ever have gotten the right to vote without a fight. Malm characterizes Scranton's position as climate fatalism and argues it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That which is said to be impossible eventually will become impossible. The more people say another future cannot be imagined, the more it indeed becomes an impossibility. The question, however, remains, is it more important to face the painful reality that the world as we know it has ended, although this may take some time to become reality? Or is it more important to try and fight for another world? I would say both, no need to choose. And I think in his own way, Scranton does try to do both. The most important question is, what are we fighting for? Are we fighting to maintain a civilization that spurs my daughter to run to H&M every other week because there is new stock? That is a world that I hope will end very, very soon. The end of the world as we know it is not all bad news. So Scranton has been called a prophet of doom. I would say he's more of an apocalyptician. While the prophet of doom predicts things in the hope people will change and the prophecies do not come true, accepting that because of this they will never be taken seriously for what they predict would happen, did not. The apocalyptician believes we are already living through the apocalypse. There is no escaping. As Scranton says, I quote, "We must live a new life, and that means a recognition of the fact that the life we now live and that humans have lived on Earth for thousands of years is gone. It's over. There's nothing we can do about 419 or 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's nothing we can do about the Arctic melting at this point. There's nothing we can do about the Amazonian diabetic at this point. There are forces at work that are unfolding. There's nothing we can do to turn the world back into to what it was before the Great Acceleration, before we started dumping carbon dioxide in the hemisphere in this major way, before carbon dioxide levels were at the place where they are in the atmosphere now. The world has already transformed, is moving into some other state, and we're in that transition now. We can see the signs. This is what scientists are reporting in their analysis. What we need then, I would argue, is an Apocalypsophy that, aside from helping us learn to live with our mortality, helps us learn to live in times of extinction. One of the questions this kind of philosophy asks is, what if there is no one left to inquire into the good, the true, and the beautiful? Classic philosophical questions. It is a kind of philosophy, however, that wanders from the beaten track, a kind of philosophy that also connects to other disciplines that engages with these kinds of questions. And one of the importance is psychoanalysis. Jacques Lacan. According to Nathan Gorelik, who explores our obsession with the end of the world from a psychoanalytic perspective, the truth concerning that much repeated mantra that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism is not that it obscures our view on a different kind of future, but that capitalism is itself the end of the world. Or as Frederick Jameson himself later remarked, we can now revise this mantra and be witness to the attempts to imagine capitalism by imagining another end of the world. Because when we look around us, that is what we see, it leads to the end. And we do our very best not to see that, to repress that knowledge. Gorelik describes us as children who keep on peeping into the abyss our parents have cut out for us. And we want to love our parents, like all children do, and take on this horrific inheritance. But how? And I quote, "Standing at this edge, eyes wide with wonder and fear and, if we're being honest, a little excitement, we imagine the worst and hope for the best." End quote. Hollywood's obsession with the apocalypse too is all about fearing the worst and hope for the best. The goal? To protect us from the painful insight that capitalism is already the end of the world and that the end has already taken place. We're already living in or after the apocalypse. And as we've already surmised from Gunther Anders' retelling of the story of Noah, the apocalypse should not be thought as something that awaits us, but as something that will have been. By continuously repeating the end of the world, mind you, according to Gorelik, this repetition of the end should be taken for what in psychology is called repetition compulsion. And by taking it for the apocalypse for a sudden event that is still to come, this is obscured from view. So we should take this repetition compulsion as a symptom, and this symptom does not point us in the direction of an actual longing for the end of the world, but to the dream that the world will keep on collapsing, therewith postponing the end indefinitely. As such, this repetition compulsion functions as a defense mechanism that protects us from the insight that capitalism cannibalizes on itself. There will come a time when there is no one or no thing left that capital can be squeezed out of. And this repetition compulsion is then similar to the deafening sound of the motorcycle gangs and zombies that Naira distinguishes, that keep us from hearing the ghosts of ourselves that warn us of our own extinction. Fantasies about the end of the world can be taken then as a defense mechanism that keeps us from facing our own extinction. We play, as Callum Matheson, in the same, so they both published an article in this volume. As Callum Matheson puts it, and once again in psychoanalytical terms, Fort Da with the apocalypse. So Fort Da is a game that Sigmund Freud distinguishes. I'll explain it in a bit. So just like the 18-month-old grandchild of Freud tried to gain control over the comings and goings of his mother by imagining it as a game, well, at least that's how Freud interpreted it, by doing as if the disappearing, the fort, and reappearing, the Da, of his mother was a game they played, we now act as if the apocalypse is something that we control. The realization that our mother could just leave, she who is the world to us, is just too painful. Just like it is just too painful to realize that the world as we know it could just disappear and we have no control over it. It is simply intolerable, unimaginable, incomprehensible. And so, we endlessly fantasize about the end and repeat these fantasies. Our playing Fort Da with the apocalypse is a way of not having to face that painful truth. When do we get really scared? When these fantasies can no longer be maintained. because of a heat wave, a flood, a pandemic, things that confront us with the fact that that's what we're really dealing with, fantasies. Now what? Following Naira, I would say we should let the ghosts of this extinction disrupt us. For as long as we keep playing these games, we lull ourselves deeper and deeper into extinction. I think I'm kind of getting over time, right? No, it's okay? Okay. Okay. It comes down then to facing the possibility of extinction. In his short essay on transience, Sigmund Freud, so I mentioned him earlier, so we have two great psychoanalytical thinkers, Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan. So Freud asks why we have such a hard time facing the finality of things. And in this essay, he describes a poet. He doesn't name him, but it's probably Rainer Maria Rilke, who, when walking around the Dolomites with Freud, so the mountains, is overwhelmed by an extreme sense of despair at the thought that all the beautiful things that they have encountered during their walk will inevitably decay. I myself am sometimes overcome by a similar feeling when I walk in the dunes. And all of a sudden, I don't find myself in the presence of an idyllic landscape, but in a future apocalyptic desert, or I just imagine it's no longer there because it's taken back by the ocean. So I can relate to the poet. It's hard to enjoy it then, still. Freud remarks that the confrontation with the fragility of existence usually spurs two very different reactions. Either we become tired of the world, like the poet, or we resist it. We simply can't imagine everything will eventually perish. This second reaction should not be taken too seriously, according to Freud. Painful things too can be true. It is the first reaction that he reflects on mostly in his essay. And he asks, so what should we do with this demand for immortality? Why should things only have value when they last forever? And why would life only have meaning when we continue it forever, even, I would say, only through our children? And he writes, and I quote, "A time may indeed come when the pictures and statues we admire today will crumble to dust. Or a race of men will follow us who no longer understand the works of our poets and thinkers. Or a geological epoch may arrive when all animate life upon the earth ceases." It's like he's describing the Anthropocene, I would say. But since the value of all this beauty and the perfection is determined only by its significance for our own emotional lives, it has no need to survive us and is therefore independent of absolute duration. End quote. Still, I would say, it is also worth lingering with the first reaction. That is, that we just can't comprehend that all the beautiful things that surround us will cease to be. Or, differently put, that we simply cannot imagine going extinct. I would say this is a classic example of what elsewhere Freud characterizes as Verleugnung, disavowal, a kind of half-denial. I know very well, but still, this is the half-denial. We know very well, like VN Secretary Antonio Guterres aptly put it at the last climate summit in Egypt, that we're on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator, but still. And therefore, all scientific reports of the UN itself, of the IPCC, of the IPBES, go in one ear, out the other. We simply cannot imagine it to be true. And that's actually quite odd, for at the same time we're already seeing that the world as we know it is changing, disappearing. Even, of course, though in the West, this is still a lot less visible than in other parts of the world. Apart from this disavowal, this I know very well, but still, I'd say we're also dealing with what cultural theorist Laurent Berland would call cruel optimism. That is, holding on to something, another human being, a way of life, an ideal that we know is impossible, just a fantasy, and most of all, not good for us. She describes cruel optimism as an attachment to something that is bad for us, that harms us. And what makes this attachment cruel is that we seemingly cannot do without it, because it gives us a sense of direction and it gives us a sense of meaning. We are dealing with cruel optimism when we desire something that is in fact detrimental to our own flourishing. So Berland gives the American dream as an example of cruel optimism. People know very well, here's disavowal again, that they're dealing with a dream that makes them unhappy, but they're still clinging to it. I would say the most detrimental form of cruel optimism nowadays is sustainability. The green dream, so to say, that promises us a sustainable future. If only we do our best to further the energy transition. Cruel optimism, as Berland explains, is also a way of suppressing debate and keep actual change from occurring. And so, instead of facing the painful reality that our way of life is unsustainable, period, we keep on buying into green dreams. For now, the costs of keeping that dream alive are mainly paid elsewhere. The big projects to get the rare minerals to pave the transition to an electrified green new world are taking place elsewhere, where the health of people, animals and ecosystems are sacrificed to keep our dream alive. Take the nickel industry in Sulawesi. This is not the worst picture, there are loads. Indonesia. So just an example, I could have also focused on the cobalt mines in Congo, or a bit closer to home, the lithium mines in Serbia or in Portugal. But returning to Sulawesi, approximately 500,000 hectares of forest have been cut down to get access to the nickel reserves over there. In the bay, where before the local population got their fish and their shellfish, there is little life left because the nickel factory dumps their heated cooling water in there. To get the nickel out of the ground, also a coal factory has been built, which is why many inhabitants now deal with airway infections. Of course, in the Netherlands, we have these sacrifice zones too. The area surrounding Tata Steel, for example, where people suffer of cancer way more often than elsewhere. And of course, the province of Groningen. Yeah, today it's been finally acknowledged. But probably nothing will happen because of this. But we need the iron, right? We need the gas. The argument is always that we need to balance the pros and cons on the long term, and that sacrifices have to be made for a transition to a sustainable world to keep that green dream alive. If that isn't cruel optimism, I don't know what is. Because also the people actually sacrificing, future generations included, don't profit from it. Still, the green dream is sold even to them. But the only thing they get is a degraded, warmer earth filled with abandoned mines and mounds of e-waste. That is the reality of the energy transition. And just like the American dream, it's a small group that actually profits from it. That will, of course, try and hold on to the dream as long as possible. Okay. So we return to Noah, who tried to ward off the apocalypse by mourning today because the day after tomorrow it would be too late. What do you do when you mourn? What is its function? Mourning is, of course, not only about dealing with the loss, but also about letting go. As Freud explains, mourning is always mourning about something, or better, about someone, very concrete. In mourning, then, it's clear who or what has been lost, and the goal of mourning is to let go of the object of mourning and finally moving on. Mourning, Freud argues, should be clearly distinguished from melancholia, that is not attached to a clear-cut object. Those who are melancholic suffer from a loss that does not have clear contours. According to American eco-psychologist René Lertzman, nowadays many suffer from what she calls climate melancholia. They suffer from the fact that things get lost, but that they can't quite put their finger on it. The object of loss is unclear. One of the reasons for this unclarity can be that the loss is anticipatory. I imagine this is the kind of loss that I myself experience when I walk in the dunes, the kind of loss also that Freud described. It can also be a kind of loss that is not recognized as such within a certain culture. So why care about a mountain being dug away? You get resources in return, right? So the process of mourning will not get stalled, there is something wrong here, sorry. So you don't need melancholy, you need mourning, that's for sure, in short. And the only way to move beyond melancholy is to make it concrete, to make it tangible, to make sure that there's a concrete object that you then let go of. Connecting this to what I started out exploring, the end of the world. The only way to move beyond melancholy, to move beyond the climate shadow that I started out with, is to make it concrete and to accept that the end of the world as we know it has already occurred. It comes down to letting go of the world as we know it, the world which we fear will end, and in so doing allow for a different future, a different end. Not the illusory future of the green dream in which we, like Benjamin's angel, would like to make whole what has been smashed, but a future in which we pick up the pieces and make the most of it. And we can console ourselves. We are already living in the ruins of capitalism. There is a phrase that keeps popping up in different languages on different walls. Another end of the world is possible was painted in black letters on a white wall in Minneapolis in 2020. A few years earlier, someone wrote in red letters, "Une autre fin du monde est possible" in Paris. There are several cases of otro fin del mundo es posible in other places. This variation on the creed of the anti-capitalists, another world is possible, is, I would say, the motto of the eco-philosopher, Apocalypsophy. This is a very difficult word. Apocalypsopher, yeah, thank you. Who does not succumb to cruel optimistic dreams and unrelenting tries to imagine another end of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your story. I'm also blown away a little bit. But I was wondering if...
Yeah, maybe it's a bit much. So reading it for the first time aloud, it's like there's a lot of end of the world going on and a lot of capitalism. So perhaps I should, I don't know, tone it down a bit.
No, but I think it's productive as well. Yeah, you have a question? Okay. Yeah, I wanted to open up to the audience for some questions. Michelle has one.
I was wondering if you could explain one thing that I was puzzled by when you were talking about Andreas Malm. And he is obviously giving a very strong sign that we need to fight and use violence even to counter all the forces of the fossil economy. Yeah. At the same time, you're saying we need to accept that we're in the middle of an apocalypse. And you were also saying, like, we can have both. We don't need to choose. I guess it has something to do with people being like, it's either fight or flight. Fight, flight, and acceptance is not really in our genes, maybe. That's also the sort of allure and that Andreas Malm has because of his battle cry.
Well, let me try and explain why I think we should do both. So now I feel I have to rewrite stuff, but you have to accept it, because otherwise I need this as an argument, because otherwise you'll keep buying into these green dreams. So if you keep on hoping for a bright green future in which everything will be fine as long as we I don't know, use technology to do whatever, then the situation keeps getting worse. So from that perspective, I'm arguing we should just accept that things are already in ruin. So in order to avoid that it's getting worse and worse, because now we're moving from fossil industry to the electrified industry, to the energy transition. It's not getting better. So perhaps for us right here it's okay, because we don't have the exhaust out in the streets. We have all electric cars now, which is amazing if you're living in downtown or the city center of Rotterdam, for example. But for others elsewhere, this is very much a problem. So this is, I think, why I stress the importance of accepting that we're already living in ruins or something, and that there's no way to in a way, there's no way to change it. But then again, I think it's also important to continue fighting also. You have to, because of course, at the same time, you have to fight the green dream people and unmask their schemes as fantasies. Yeah.
Just to follow up, and then what would be the best way to fight them? Is that by picturing this other end of the world?
I am not fully convinced by Andreas Malm. I think I myself very much enjoyed the Extinction Rebellion way of doing things, because it's a very welcoming group of people, and everyone's there. It's from 16 to 80. And it works because it's non-violent and it's growing, but it's not. So Andreas Malm argues that we should blow up pipelines, perhaps. I'm not necessarily against it. I'm not going to do it though. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. I think that was really great. But you kept on mentioning this term "end of the world" a lot. And for me, the end of the world is not, if you think of deep time, it's not the end of the world. It's just the end of the world for, I'd say it's more individualistic. So it's like, then it's an instance. So it's an instant moment of the end of the world. And if you think of it like that, then isn't it the end of the world is happening constantly over and over again in this sort of pluralistic view of animals, insects, us, like individuals. It seems more individualistic than this identity of like, oh, it's the end of the world, because the end of the world will continue.
Well, sure, it's the end. So okay, so it's the end of the world as we know it. We then, and that's a very typical we. Of course, things are always changing. Species are always going extinct. Then again, yeah, this is, I don't know, we have had 5 mass extinctions and now we're in the 6th. So there is something different. And then, of course, the whole Anthropocene debate is about trying to figure our role in that and trying to find a way to relate to that, to deal with it, perhaps by arguing against a concept like the Anthropocene, because then you're once again putting the anthropos, putting humans on a pedestal, which is probably what got us into this mess in the first place. And so from that perspective, you could perhaps think of I don't know, a concept like Capitalism. Yeah, I very much like the more intersectional approach, where you try to get a feel for this crisis by focusing and on colonial practices and on capitalism, yeah, And then from a philosophical perspective on modernity, enlightenment thought, and how it connects to that as well. And then, of course, try and, I don't know, act and think differently. Because in the end, of course, so I keep on, I don't know, arguing we're going extinct anyway, but of course it's not really true. There's always this aspect that we find in Noah as well. So you keep on, you say you have to take this very seriously in order for it, of course. I don't know. It's not like I think we can avoid the mass extinction, but perhaps it can be less bad, or I don't know. It's not one massive thing, and perhaps that's what your question was concerned with as well. It's not this one thing, and then afterwards there's nothing. It's very final, and of course, even a mass extinction is not final in that manner. Yeah, it's more.
There was a question over there, right?
Also, to come back a bit on this, I have always the feeling that extinction, catastrophe is always a question of a break. And my question actually goes to the other way. What about pace? And I'm thinking about Rob Nixon with slow violence. And what if we turn the table, which means that we use slow violence, the other way around, to try to reach a better understanding of death, of the ends, of what it means on the long term? What do you think about that?
Oh, that's. I'm not quite sure if I get your. I think there's an amazing question in there, amazing, but I'm not really sure. So, but are you asking if we should think in terms of slow apocalypse, perhaps? I'm not really sure if that what you're getting at. So we should.
Understand things slowly instead of
Yeah.
always looking for breaks.
Yeah.
Breaks for better, breaks for worst. What about slowly thinking about it?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's very important. And then, of course, developing an eye for these slow apocalypses. Although, of course, on a geological timescale, slow apocalypses can be, I don't know, quite quick. But I'm reminded now of the insect die-out. So there was a few years back this research on insects in Germany, and then later on we find that in Costa Rica and other places as well, I don't know, it was like 75% to 90% die-out of insects. And of course, we could have noticed that kind of slow apocalypse that, of course, we now know via the help of science, but we could have also seen it on our windscreens. Because, yeah, I don't know, I could have seen it because when I was young, I drove through Europe on vacation by car. We had to clean the windscreens a lot, and now we don't. So, yeah, and then developing a kind of eye for that slow apocalypses going on. Yeah.
There's room for one or two more questions. If there's no one else, then you can ask. Like, sorry. Yeah, you can.
I was thinking of a conversation I had with a friend some time ago, and he was talking about the amazing, how do you say, wave of very young punk bands in Rotterdam these days, but also in Amsterdam. That there's this new wave of punk music, and really hardcore, fanatical, often very politicized.
Hang
punk
Youth
band.
is a good
Hang
example.
Youth is one of them, of course. Sophie Straat in Amsterdam. We have many here in Rotterdam. And he said, yeah, well, that's because it's the end of the world. He said they think it's the end of everything is going to shit. And that's when punk bands come up. And indeed, I mean, if you look at 40 years or 45 years ago when punk music and punk fashion and the whole punk scene came up, that was in the time of the Cold War and also in the time of environmental catastrophe. And but especially the looming end of the world through nuclear destruction. Now, I was thinking, also listening to your talk, and which also has an amazing literary energy. Is there also something happening right now? I mean, of course, it's a shame that the world is going to end, but at least it's producing some really good art and some really good music and good literature. Isn't that what is going on now? The same as in...
I don't know. Yeah. You know, the thing is, I imagine there's quite a lot of similarities between the 80s, yeah, and punk bands that we had, that the No Future, I don't know, Buttons and etc. And what's happening now, I have a lot of students writing essays about the human voluntary extinction movement, and also about not wanting to have any children. There's a movement, the anti-natalist movement. But I wouldn't say this is, I don't know, that we're just seeing, this was maybe not your question, but that we just see a repetition of catastrophic fears, and then they subside, and then they resurface, and then they subside. No, but your question about, I don't know, this being good for art, it's just, I don't know, it's too painful, I think, to, yeah.
Well, on that happy note, let's continue the conversation at the bar. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your talk. A warm applause.